The future-gazing publication, The World Ahead, by The Economist, has brought together experts from around the world to reveal what lies ahead in more than 90 countries, in 24 languages, to an international audience of more than 2.8 million people. During this era that feels unpredictable and unprecedented, their insights are essential reading for individuals and policymakers and professionals alike. The council has had a long-standing relationship with The Economist, where we have been able to bring expert-level analysis of existential issues straight to you. We are thrilled to bring this program back today for an especially interesting look into a new year following one of so much uncertainty and change. What truly lies ahead for 2025? Hello and good morning. Welcome to the program. I'm Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Our program today features Tom Standage, Deputy Editor of The Economist, in conversation with Council President Emeritus Jim Falk. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend you subscribe to The Economist and keep up to date with the world ahead. I'd like to thank Global Santa Fe, World Affairs Council of Connecticut, World Now with Jim Falk, and the World Affairs Councils of America in Washington, D.C. for partnering with us on this webinar. We really appreciate the ability to work together on all of these virtual programs. I want to take a moment to thank our institutional partners, AT&T, AECOM, City of Dallas, Dallas College, Fidelity, Frost Bank, Goldman Sachs, Harwood International, Haynes and Boone, Hillwood, Jackson Shaw, Lockheed Martin, NEC Corporation of America, PNC Bank, PwC, Sidley Austin, SMU, Cox School of Business, Truist Bank, and Vistra Energy. Our council, just so you know, will be taking a programming break until early January for the holidays. So keep an eye on our emails and look at our website at dfwworld.org to look at all of the programming that we have coming up right after the break. And if you're not a member of the World Affairs Council yet, we're a members-based organization, as are our partners around the nation, and we need you. Please do join our council or our partners if you live in their areas, and you can check out our membership options at dfwworld.org and be a part of the national and international conversations that are going on in all of our regions. And then lastly, I just want to take a very quick moment to mention that these virtual conversations are testament to the power of collective curiosity that we have in our World Affairs Council network. Right now, our council here in Dallas-Fort Worth is carrying out our annual fund campaign, and it's all about bridging the gap and supporting civil discourse. It's extremely important in today's landscape of polarization. So please do join us and support us. We need your help. It's critical to our mission, and we thank you very much for your consideration. And now with that, I will pass it over to our moderator of today's webinar, Jim Falk. Jim is the President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. As I mentioned, he was with us for 20 years and did such phenomenal things with our council. He now resides in Santa Fe and is on the board of Global Santa Fe. And he also streams every Monday evening the forum at ksfr.org. So check that out as well. And with that, Jim, take it away. And thanks very much again.
Thank you so much, and hello, everyone. Liz, I have to say, when I was there, it didn't take me that long to read all our supporters. Congratulations. It's a really strong testament to the great work that you're doing. And indeed, it is a holiday tradition for the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth to host this conversation with Tom Standage, and even before his predecessor, Dan Franklin, who was the editor of The World Ahead. Tom joined The Economist as a science correspondent back in 1998, and he subsequently held a number of positions: technology editor, business editor, and digital editor. You hear a theme there? Well, he also earned his degree at Oxford in engineering and computing, so no surprise. He's the author of 6 history books, including Writing on the Wall, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, which I really loved reading, An Edible History of Humanity, which I want to order, and then this book, The Victorian Internet, Tom, when I was looking at your bio, I realized I did not know about this book. And then I saw one of the reviews in the Wall Street Journal, and it said, described it as a .com cult classic. So I had to order it, where you do discuss the similarities of how the telegraph and the internet impacted diplomacy. So lots of fun to read that in just a few days, I hope. Great to see you, Tom. Thanks for being with us.
Great to be here again. Yes, that book came out in 1998 before the dot-com crash. So, and amazingly, it's still in print because it was all about stuff happening in the 19th century. So it was all, it was all out of date by the time the dot-com crash happened. And it just keeps on going. So yeah, it's great.
Well, I saw just how many people had continued to order it, so
Yeah,
there's obviously interest.
I was
So,
sitting next. I was sitting next to Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, once at a dinner, and he said we were talking for a while. And he said, "There's this great book you should read. It's called The Victorian Internet." And I said, "Yeah, I wrote it." Yeah, so it's good.
so like we've done in past years, I have just a few questions to ask you, and then we want to hear about your top 10. And let me encourage our audience, we really do want to hear from you. There's always such good questions, so just pop it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. One of the things I was thinking about yesterday is there was such turmoil at the LA Times and the Washington Post about whether or not to do a presidential endorsement. I think it was on Halloween, October 31st, you came out with your endorsement at The Economist in favor of Kamala Harris. Was there a lot of discussion about one, whether to even do an endorsement, and how did you go about it?
We've done endorsements for decades, and we don't have a party political affiliation at The Economist. So a lot of newspapers in Britain do, and they're sort of my party right or wrong about it. So the Daily Telegraph is never going to support a Labour Prime Minister. That's just not what it's there for. It's the kind of the party journal of the Conservative Party. So we're slightly different at The Economist. We are very open about our bias, such as it is, which is for liberalism in the 19th century sense. So for free trade and for sort of personal freedom as well. And that has led us to endorse both Republican and Democratic candidates in the US in the past. We also say, if we had a vote in other elections around the world, in Britain, in Nigeria, in India, in South Africa, wherever it is. And very often what happens is the local press will say, oh, this British newspaper is meddling in the politics of, this country or that country, and they should stay out. But we've done this for a very long time, and they say, well, such critics tend to say it's all right for The Economist to endorse a candidate in the British election, but they should stay out of politics elsewhere. But actually, most of our readers are in North America, so we think saying what we would do under these circumstances is not unreasonable. And what we tend to do with these endorsement meetings is, it's something we discuss at the editorial meeting on a Monday, and we usually have somebody who makes the case for each of the candidates or each of the parties, and that was exactly what we did in this case. And we had our Washington bureau chief who made the case for Trump and said, this is where Trump supporters are coming from, and I actually found that extremely illuminating. And then we had someone else who made the case for Kamala Harris, and then we discussed it, and and then we made our decision, and that tends to be how it works. And I remember some of these meetings. I don't think it was terribly surprising that we endorsed Harris, but I remember when we endorsed George W. Bush. I think it must have been the first time around. I remember being quite surprised that I thought that meeting could have gone either way. And I think we endorsed him because we thought he was more of a free trader than Al Gore would have been. But I have to say, it's not a foregone conclusion, and it's not the editor saying I'm going to do this. And what it most certainly is not is like some proprietor saying you have to support this candidate or that candidate, or you have to not support anyone at all because it will make me look bad. So The
Mhm.
Economist is extremely independent. We have quite a large number of shareholders. None of them has a decisive, even the larger shareholder, which I think has about 40% of the shares, can only vote 20% of them, and there is absolutely no editorial influence that those shareholders hold. And so this is really unusual. We really can do whatever we want
Yeah.
and say whatever we want, and our shareholders understand that, and
Well,
they do not try to influence that decision. That is a very different situation from what we saw at the LA Times and the Washington Post, where the proprietors were clearly worried that endorsing someone who wasn't Donald Trump would cause problems with Donald Trump down the line. And that's, I think, an indictment of the way things are going in US media. Unfortunately, there isn't the same degree of independence that we have.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons you have so many subscribers in North America. I know your production schedule for the world ahead must be almost a nightmare at times, but this year it had to be extremely difficult because you really didn't know what was going to happen on November 5th, and you aimed to publish when in mid-November.
We aimed to publish just before Thanksgiving. So we knew that we were coming out on November the 23rd. And so we knew we had to close our pages on November the 15th. So we had 10 days after the election. So I was hoping for a decisive, victory one way or the other. And that's exactly what we got very, very quickly. It was kind of like the old days, actually. We haven't had an election where you got a result this quickly for a while. I think since Bush 2, I think. Or maybe no, maybe we did with Obama. But I was worried that we would have something like what we had in 2020, where there was a week or so of to and fro, and then of course the nightmare scenario was 2000, where we didn't get a result until almost Christmas, right? So that was really what I was concerned about, that we were not going to know. In the event, we did know very quickly, and we were able to adjust things appropriately, and change the slant of some of our coverage. I mean, for example, the impact on Latin America. We ended up actually having an entirely new lead article in the Americas section, because it was clear that the sorts of things that Trump was talking about, that Latin America was going to bear the brunt of a lot of his policies. So on immigration and tariffs in particular. So I think that's the kind of that was the kind of outcome that journalistically made life much easier for us, and I'm glad we haven't. I think it's also good for the country that there was a clear result, and even that Trump won the popular vote, because that is, he won all 7 of the swing states. He's got the trifecta in Congress as well. So I think in a lot of respects, it's good that you can have a clear result in this way, and you can have a clear and clean transfer of power, and we're not going to have another January the 6th. And also, I hope it means that Republicans stop grumbling about how everything's rigged against them and they can't win elections, and all the rest of it. I mean, what's amazing is how quickly all of that nonsense went away. Election night, Trump was saying terrible things happening in Pennsylvania, and then when it was apparent that he was going to win, suddenly everyone is like, no, no, this is all fine. So I really hope that puts an end to certainly the sort of conspiratorial thinking in the Republican Party, that there are terrible, terrible things wrong with the American electoral system, because evidently they are able to win and they can win decisively. So that's what's happening.
I think I'll share your hope on that. Last question for me before we turn it over to you for the trends. What distinguishes the world ahead is that we actually get to know who your writers are. And perhaps you might tell us, is there now more pressure to have that change in the weekly newspaper or not?
No, I don't think the weekly newspaper is ever going to stop being anonymous, because it's such a part of our brand. But there are other places sort of around the edge of the core Economist, where you can see who we are. I mean, obviously on social media, but actually on our own platforms as well. So in our newsletters, in our podcast, in our videos, and in the world ahead, you do get to see who the journalists are. We know that subscribers like that, and I think our US politics podcast, Checks and Balance, is our most popular subscriber podcast, and I think the camaraderie and getting to know the presenters there is a really big part of that. So yeah, but whenever this comes up, people say, does this mean that you're moving towards having an end to the policy of anonymity in the Economist itself? And the answer is no. So I can't see that one changing.
Well, let's go with your top 10.
Sure. Okay, let's dive in then. So I'll turn on my slides. Yes, it's been an interesting year. It was obviously a difficult year to put all this together, because the US election could have gone either way. But now that we've got the result, we're sort of in a world where there's still massive uncertainty, because we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. And it meant putting things together, which starts in May, was quite tricky this year as well, because we have these guest writers who write for us, and we needed a sort of a selection of interesting people, but we couldn't choose people who were on one side of the aisle or the other when it came to the US election, because it would look very odd. So I'm actually very pleased with the selection we ended up with. We have Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, who is now arguably the sort of foreign leader that the incoming Trump administration is looking to most closely as a sort of model for the kind of radical changes that they might make. If you look at what he's done to the Argentinian economy, some really, really dramatic policy changes, which he's been able to do because he's essentially come from outside of politics and has not got a sort of big constituency of people who say, no, you can't do that. And it really is breathtaking how decisive, I mean, whether you agree with his policies or not, just, really radical change. This is what it looks like. The man who campaigned with a chainsaw, and boy, is he delivering on that. We also have Edgars Rinkēvičs, the president of Latvia, who is, potentially right on the front line with Russia there. And he's writing about European security. We have Fei-Fei Li, the godmother of AI. It was her lab at Stanford where the ImageNet contest happened in 2012, and that's now regarded as the beginning of the modern AI boom. And Casey Handmer is another of our guests. He's a very interesting entrepreneur, and he reminds me of the way Elon Musk was 20 years ago, in a good way. I mean, he's the kind of, he's got this sort of swashbuckling, interested in lots of different things, very, very smart, very entrepreneurial. And he's definitely a person to watch, I think. Anyway, so I boiled down all of these predictions from my colleagues and from our external guests, and I put them into my top 10, which looks like this. And so I'm going to take you through that now. And so, as I said, I mean, you won't be surprised to hear that the sort of Trumpian uncertainty that hangs over the whole world as we go into 2025 is the biggest theme, because Donald Trump has said he's going to do some really quite drastic things. And so the choices he makes for American policy will affect the whole world in areas from immigration and defense to economics and trade. The trouble is we don't know exactly what he's going to do. He says he's going to impose these big tariffs in order to try and rebuild American manufacturing. He says he wants to deport millions of unauthorized immigrants. He says he's going to end the war in Ukraine in a single day. He wants to not just keep the tax cuts that were there from his first term, but he actually wants to extend them. And he wants to slash government bureaucracy with the help of Elon Musk. So this is what he says. The big question is, what will he actually do? And he'll probably do some version of some of these things, but we don't know how far he'll go, and we don't know which ones he'll prioritize. So there's a lot of room for uncertainty and for potentially massive change. And that's the second theme. 2024 has been, as we pointed out in our edition last year, the biggest year in history for elections. And we've had more elections in more countries and more people voting than ever before. And the theme that has come out of this is that around the world, incumbent parties, ruling parties have done badly. They have lost support, and in some cases, they've lost altogether. And this happened regardless of their political orientation. It doesn't, it's not a move in some particular direction towards the left or towards the right or towards nationalism or anything like that. It was just generally like not whatever we have now. People have voted for change. And so incumbent parties have been chucked out, as in America, as in Britain. In other cases, they've been forced into coalitions, like in India and South Africa. They've been pushed in other cases into cohabitation or into minority government. And that's what we've seen in, say, Taiwan and France and Japan. So I think that sets up 2025 to be a year of expectations. Can new leaders deliver? And can those leaders who were chastened by the electoral results and by voters' choices, can they change their ways? And I think the person who, of course, has the most expectation of change riding on them is Donald Trump, because he really has promised to shake things up, and that's what voters are buying this year. Voters want change. They want people who are really going to change things and shake things up. And so again, we come back to this question of, will Donald Trump deliver on his promises? So let's look at two areas in particular where he's promised big change and where the implications are global, and those are in foreign policy and in economics. So let's start with foreign policy. Donald Trump has said he's going to end the war in Ukraine in a day. And more broadly, I think Ukraine is going to be the first test of his new foreign policy. What's he going to do? Is he going to pull the plug on aid to Ukraine and propose a deal with Vladimir Putin that lets Russia keep the territory it's conquered? That's looking like the plan. And I think the big question is, will, if that's the case, will America provide some kind of security guarantee to to Ukraine, to deter Russia from coming back in the future and trying to grab a bit more? Because Russia's done this before, right? It's signed deals and then it said, actually, we'd like to invade and have a bit more of your country. So if America did provide a security guarantee like that, that would really enhance its credibility. It would make Donald Trump look good. But if he forces Ukraine into a lopsided deal that still leaves it vulnerable to Russia, then Vladimir Putin will have won. He will have made the point that in today's world, you really can invade a next door country and you can keep whatever you get. And Ukraine's survival would then, in the longer term, depend on whether European powers are willing to come to its aid. And that's looking not terribly likely. I mean, they've got other problems of their own. So, I think abandoning Ukraine really would send a signal, if America does that, that its promises are empty and it's not really going to stand by its allies elsewhere in the world. And that would encourage troublemaking by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, otherwise known as CRINC, or the Quartet of Chaos. And it would also, I think, encourage more meddling by regional powers, the sort of thing that we've seen in Sudan, where the terrible civil war, the two sides are backed by Egypt on the one hand and the UAE on the other. In the Middle East more broadly, what's Donald Trump going to do? We don't know. We suspect he will just give Israel a free hand in its conflict in Gaza and Lebanon. But it may be that there's this sort of tentative ceasefire in Lebanon. There may be one on the cards in Gaza. It's also possible that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to wait until Trump is in office before he does that deal to give him a quick win. But we'll see. The broader picture, though, is that Donald Trump and those around him want to really focus on rivalry with China, and that means being less engaged in the Middle East and Europe. But I think even in the case of the rivalry with China, given Trump's more transactional approach towards alliances, he famously asked whether South Korea was paying to be an ally of the United States, and he was quite surprised to hear that it wasn't. This is a sort of mafia boss, protection racket view of alliances. So it really is unclear whether America would stand up to China in the event of a conflict over Taiwan, or whether it would say, come to the assistance of the Philippines if there was a crisis in the South China Sea. We honestly don't know. And Trump's view is that this sort of unpredictability is a deterrent. Because you don't know what he's going to do, you're not going to try anything. And apparently there was a phone call in 2020 where he was talking to Xi Jinping, and he said, don't try anything with Taiwan or we'll bomb the hell out of you. And, when the owner of such an enormous nuclear arsenal says something like that, what do you do? I think the risk, though, is that if his unpredictability comes to be seen as just empty bluster, particularly if he just gives way on Ukraine and lets Putin do whatever he wants, then that could actually embolden America's autocratic foes rather than acting as a deterrent. So that's foreign policy. We honestly don't know what he's going to do there, but we do know he's going to be very transactional. Similarly, with economic policy, we don't know how far things are going to go. He's talked about 60% import tariffs on Chinese goods and 10 to 25% on other countries. Is it a negotiating ploy? Well, the case for believing that it is that recent threat of 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. They both export about 80% of their exports to the US. This would be absolutely devastating for their economies if there was a 25% tariff. It would also be very bad for American companies as well, big car makers that make a lot of their most popular models in Mexico or Canada. That would be a big problem for them, and American businesses that would make the cost of their inputs more expensive. So this would have big economic impact both on exporting countries but on America as well. Of course, there are tariffs in place already, but they are quite specific and quite targeted. And what Trump is talking about is these sort of sweeping universal tariffs on absolutely everything. Last time America tried that was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, which led to global trade falling by 2/3. So this is quite frightening. But that's why, you can make the case that he doesn't really mean it, and he's just trying to get concessions out of these countries before he comes into office. And we saw this with this 25% threat. He then spoke to both Trudeau and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, and he said that that Claudia Sheinbaum had agreed to close the border and stop drugs and illegal immigrants coming into America. She immediately tweeted to say that actually this is not what she had promised, but he's clearly trying to, he's trying to get something in return for this threat, and then maybe he won't impose such big tariffs. We'll see. But I think even a small tariff, even a 10% universal tariff, is reckoned to knock about 1 percentage point off America's growth, it would also be, you know, quite devastating for America's biggest trading partners, China, Mexico, and Canada in particular. And if other parts of the world introduce their own retaliatory tariffs, then that would affect their growth as well. So this really is a threat to global growth, and to America's own economy. I think China is particularly worried about this. It's already struggling to meet its 5% growth target. And so an intensification of the trade dispute it has with the US, which has been going on since the first Trump presidency, would make things a lot worse. Now, staying with China for a bit, um, what China has been doing in response to the fact that its domestic economy is much weaker as a result of a crisis in the property industry, it's been focusing on export-led growth, and in particular, exports of solar panels, batteries, EVs, so clean technology. And the result has been a clean tech boom, with adoption of solar panels and grid storage in particular, repeatedly outstripping forecasts. If you look at this, this is one of my favorite charts. The chart on the right, you can see the chart on the left is the plummeting price of solar panels, and they're down like 99.9% since the beginning of the 1990s. But the one on the right is the adoption of solar, and the yellow lines are where the forecasts think it's going to go. In other words, it goes up, and then people say, yeah, well, it's not going to go up that fast anymore, and now it's going to go to the right on the long list yellow line, and it never does. It just keeps going up and up and up, and it's basically going vertical now. This is exponential growth. It really is extraordinary. This is very good news that the forecasters are persistently too pessimistic, because it means that adoption of clean tech is happening much more quickly than people expected. It's happening in particular in China, which has got more new solar and wind capacity under construction. In fact, it's got twice as much as the rest of the world put together. But the rest of the world can also benefit from the low prices of this technology, and we're seeing countries across the developing world in particular loading up on cheap Chinese solar. Look at the explosion of solar adoption in Pakistan, for example, which is fantastic. This is good for the world because it means that renewable energy is much cheaper than it would otherwise be. Thank you, basically, to the subsidies of the Chinese government. In Europe and America, there's a lot of concern about this because of the risk of reliance on China for this crucial technology, and efforts to sort of protect local producers, protect car makers, try to get battery companies and solar panel producers off the ground. It's not going terribly well, I have to say. The battery champion of Europe, Northvolt, has just gone bust, and attempts to sort of protect American producers of solar panels. You know, there hasn't been the expansion that Joe Biden wanted to see. Tariffs on the one hand, subsidies on the other. It's not leading to the. It certainly hasn't led to a political payoff for him either. And I really am not convinced that the US and European car makers can come back from this. They cannot compete with Chinese EVs, which are extremely good and extremely cheap. And even with 40% tariffs on them in Europe, they are still cheaper and better than anything European car makers can make. So so that is quite tricky. But I think if you look at the picture for the world, the availability of cheap Chinese clean tech is a good thing overall. And we may get more good news in 2025 because we may find out whether global greenhouse gas emissions have peaked. This depends on China in particular. It's the world's biggest emitter, as well as being the world's fastest adopter of clean tech. And if its emissions have peaked, and we should find out when it submits its figures at the end of this month, it has to submit them every 2 years. A lot of analysts think that its emissions actually peaked in 2023 and have been falling in 2024. And if that's true, then global emissions will also have peaked. This would not mean that climate change is solved. We still have to get emissions to net zero, but it would mean that we were on our way. So that would be good news. And not even Donald Trump can stop this. He's a climate skeptic, and he talks about drill, baby, drill. But we should remember that 80% of Joe Biden's clean energy subsidies go to Republican states. And that really what happens on climate is up to states, it's up to individual cities, it's up to individual companies. And the president doesn't really have a lot of influence over it. And there's one estimate that the US is going to spend $6 trillion between now and 2050 on clean tech. And if Donald Trump hadn't won, that would be 7 trillion. So, you know, it's still a huge amount of money. It's just slightly less than it would have been if he hadn't been president. So I think that tells you that the energy transition has a momentum of its own, and it's essentially because of the low price of clean technology. Moving to economics more broadly, the shift, I think, is from the main concern of policymakers and central bankers being inflation, and inflation does seem to be in retreat now around the world. And instead, what people are worried about is deficits. And the US is running a 6% federal budget deficit. It's spending more on debt servicing this year than it does on the military, which is saying something because the US is the biggest spender on the military. And it's not alone. Other countries have also increased their spending during the pandemic and have not ratcheted it back down again. So in Britain, we are grappling with not being able to balance the books here as well. France and Italy also have worryingly large deficits. This is why the French government just collapsed, because they can't agree on a plan to balance the books. So we did not hear about austerity during the elections of 2024. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump promised policies that would have increased the size of the deficit. In Kamala Harris's case, not by quite so much, but Donald Trump is talking about some really quite dramatic increases in spending, well, by cutting taxes. He wants to blow up the deficit, and did a pretty good job of blowing it up in his first term. So what do you do about this? Well, he says he's going to cut spending, and that Elon Musk is going to help him balance the books that way. We'll see. The difficulty with getting rid of a deficit is you either have to increase taxes, cut spending, some combination of the two, or boost growth. And all of those things are quite tricky. I think the US has quite rapid growth. The danger, though, is that Donald Trump's tariff plans put that growth in jeopardy. It would reduce growth in the US and elsewhere, making deficit reduction harder. The other thing is that his tariff plans are, in effect, a sales tax on US consumers. He talks about tariffs as if they are something that is paid by exporting countries, and that by putting tariffs on China, you're basically helping yourself to money from China. This is not how tariffs work. They are paid for by importers in the US, who then pass the prices on to customers. And we saw this in the first Trump term with things like tariffs on white goods, on washing machines. They basically just got more expensive for American consumers. And so the risk is that this actually reignites inflation, because if you increase prices for consumers, that's inflation. And so we'll see what happens. But I think the danger here is that that what he's doing is incompatible with his desire to cut taxes, and no amount of government spending is going to get you there unless he's prepared to cut military spending. This doesn't add up. And tariffs are not a magic money tree that will cure all of America's problems. So, yeah, difficult choices loom around the world, because many countries have deficits that they want to deal with. And in Europe, many countries want to increase their defense spending, but that increases the difficulty of balancing the books. So that's really tough. So we're going to have a lot of arguments about balancing budgets next year. And in fact, Donald Trump may face opposition from his own party, because there are still some Republicans who, think that America should live within its means. More generally, this has been a year where questions of age have come up a lot. Joe Biden obviously bowed out because he was told that he was too old to run, and now America has just picked its oldest ever president-elect. So expect more discussion of age limits for political leaders. North Dakota has recently passed a law on this, setting a maximum age for its state representatives in Congress. And we actually looked at the ages of world leaders, and what we found is that world leaders are getting older all over the world as the populations age. And this is not surprising in autocratic countries, because obviously autocrats they tend to stay in power until they die. So if people are living longer, then autocratic leaders are getting older. The interesting exception is that in democracies, the average age of leaders has actually declined slightly in the last 50 years. In 1975, we had no fully democratic country with a leader under the age of 45. We now have three, which are Chile, Ireland, and Guyana. So on average, in countries where people are free to choose their own leaders, they are choosing younger leaders. The glaring exception to this is the United States, which has a lot of very old politicians. And that's essentially just because the American political system favors incumbency and seniority. Gerrymandering of districts means most political races are uncompetitive. So once you're elected, you can basically keep your seat until you die in much of America. Looking at populations as a whole, East Asia is the part of the world that's aging most quickly, and it has a milestone coming up in 2025. All of its baby boomer generation, its post-war baby boomers, will be 75 or older, and that means looking after them is about to get much more expensive. This is called the 2025 problem in Japan, and this is going to be the year that it really starts to feel its age. China, meanwhile, is looking for economic opportunity in an aging world by promoting what it calls the silver economy, and this is making goods and services and technologies for old people, initially to serve an aging population at home, and then the hope is you can open up export markets for elder tech. Staying with tech, it's going to be a crunch year for AI, I think. There's been this weird disparity between how much is being spent on it and how much investment is going into it and how much companies are actually using it. So something like $1.5 trillion is going into data centers for AI between 2024 and 2027. So that's chips, servers, and then the buildings and all the power systems and cooling systems and all the rest of it. And at the same time, if you ask companies in America if they're actually using AI, only about 5% of them say they are. So if you look at these charts here, you can see the companies on the left that are selling shovels in the gold rush. So it's the chip makers and the server manufacturers. You look on the right, you've got basically a bit under 5% of companies saying that they're using AI, and about 6.5% saying they might be using it in production in core sort of business processes in the next 6 months. So this is quite a striking disparity between investor enthusiasm and actual adoption. And we're not seeing AI filtering through into sort of broader productivity improvements or anything like that. So this does look a bit unsustainable. What's going on? Well, maybe it just takes time, and maybe, you know, adoption of AI, you have to retrain workers and reinvent processes and all that kind of thing. Maybe the technology needs to get a little bit better. The big buzzword for 2025 is agentic AI, agent-based systems which are capable of planning and executing more complex tasks. Maybe that will cause adoption to accelerate. But I think something else is going on here, which is if you look at surveys of how many employees use AI, you get a very different answer. It's not 5%, it's about 35% overall. And in some fields, it's much, much higher. 78% of software engineers are using AI at least once a week, and 75% of human resources staff. So I think this suggests that there's a lot of people using AI. They're just using it in secret and they're not telling the boss. So why would this be happening? Well, I think it's because if you're using AI to, you know, make your work slicker and get stuff done more quickly, you might not want to reveal this to your co-workers or to your superiors because it gives you an edge, and, you know, you're going to get that promotion before the guy sitting next to you. But you also might worry that if this higher productivity is something that your boss knows about, they're just going to give you more work. Or worse still, they might say, well, train everyone in your team how to do all these wonderful things with AI, and then we can fire half of them. So I think this suggests that the AI adoption problem is as much a management and cultural challenge as a technological one. And I think to get the most out of the technology and to get adoption out there and to really benefit from it, bosses need to create an environment that incentivizes openness and experimentation rather than secrecy and suspicion, which is what we're seeing now. So I think the race is on in 2025, really to figure out how to adopt AI in a sort of, you know, more open and broader way before investors lose their nerve. So we'll see what happens next year. Something else that's going on around the world is it's getting harder to travel. It's getting harder to fly in particular. Conflict is disrupting global aviation as airlines avoid conflict zones and avoid flying over unfriendly countries. If you look flying from New York to Delhi on the top map, it takes American Airlines 2 hours longer to get there because, unlike Air India, American does not want to fly over Russia. And then similarly, there's another map there showing, you know, Turkish Airlines was diverting its planes around Iran earlier this year because it was worried about a big missile strike that was about to happen. And this, you know, this makes things take longer. So we're seeing these sorts of restrictions, avoiding flying over Ukraine, avoiding flying over the Middle East, really causing problems. And there's other sources of friction to global travel as well. Europe is adding new border checks. Its borderless Schengen system is fraying, and it's introducing a sort of ESTA style system, the thing that we in Europe have to apply for to visit the United States. Well, Europe's about to do the same for everybody else, and so is Britain, by the way. And there's also been a backlash against tourism more broadly in Europe. Tourist arrivals reached record levels in 2024, finally rebounding back above their pre-pandemic level. But we've seen concern that essentially the interests of tourists are being prioritized over those of locals. In Amsterdam, in Barcelona, in New York, there have been restrictions introduced on short-term rental platforms like Airbnb because the concern is that this is pricing locals out of local rental markets. And we're seeing other measures as well. Venice has introduced an entry fee for day trippers. Pompeii is capping daily visitors, and so on. I think what's actually happened here is that tourism obviously collapsed during the pandemic, and in order to get back to its pre-pandemic level, it's been growing very quickly. It's been growing at about 50% a year. in terms of the number of international arrivals each year. And a 50% growth rate really is, that feels unmanageable if you live in a very touristified city. Previously, before the pandemic, tourism arrivals were growing at a rate of about 5%. So this does feel very, very unsustainable. But I think that the growth rate should go back to something closer to its pre-pandemic level during 2025, because that catch-up growth has now occurred. So tourist numbers will still continue to climb, but probably at a more sedate pace. And that should mean that the backlash against over-tourism should diminish in 2025. But tourist restrictions and these sorts of restrictions on Airbnbs, which affect business travelers as well, will remain in place. Finally, it's been a surprising year. We've had 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump. We had bombs hidden inside exploding walkie-talkies in Lebanon. We had a giant rocket going to the edge of space and being caught by the world's biggest pair of chopsticks. We have North Korean troops being deployed to fight for Russia and Ukraine. We have the collapse of the regime in Syria. We had an attempted coup in South Korea. And we have Elon Musk being put in charge of a government cost-cutting initiative which is named after a crypto coin, which is in turn named after a dog meme. So if you'd been told all of this a year ago, if I'd said all of that to you when I was speaking to you a year ago, you'd have said, what are you smoking? So I think one lesson of 2024 is to expect the unbelievable. It seems that unbelievable things are happening more than we expect them to. And that suggests in turn that we should pay more attention to things that sound implausible but could happen. So we'll have a selection of them in the world ahead this year that I've put together. Just to touch on a couple of them, could there be a devastating solar storm that knocks out satellites and power grids for several months? So some storms like this have happened in the past, and we know this from tree ring data. The last really big one was in 1859. And obviously back then we didn't have satellites and power grids that could be knocked out. The only thing we did have, funnily enough, was the Victorian internet, the telegraph network, which melted down. But we now have a lot of satellites and power grids which would be really badly affected by a big solar storm. And there are estimates that it could take 5 months to get the US power grid back online. It could cause trillions of dollars worth of damage, and so on. So if you live in a part of the world that relies on air conditioning, this could be really quite serious. And of course, other, transport would be disrupted. The GPS system would get wiped out. Honestly, this would be a big deal. And the sun is at solar maximum right now. I've actually seen the aurora borealis, the northern lights, twice this year from my house in London, which I don't think has ever happened before. So the next 6 months is not an impossible time for this to happen. And people have said that the chances of a really big solar storm could be 5 to 10% next year. Other possibilities of things that could happen next year. We're going to have a 4G network on the moon. Think of the roaming charges, though. We may get more text from these carbonized scrolls found in a Roman villa, and they're being decoded using AI. These are 2,000-year-old scrolls that were carbonized by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. But Casey Hanmer, funnily enough, the guy I mentioned at the beginning, who I think is kind of the next Elon Musk, he made one of the crucial breakthroughs that have allowed text to be extracted from these scrolls. So I think that's really interesting. Less happily, there is a nasty strain of bird flu going around, H5N1. It's spread to farm animals in the US, which is doing a really bad job of getting on top of it. Also, researchers in that community are complaining that America is not being as open as it could be about the genetic sequence of this particular strain of bird flu. And that's kind of ironic, because that was America's complaint about Chinese scientists not being open enough and the Chinese government not being open enough in the early days of the COVID pandemic. But this is causing real concern among people who follow such things. The UN keeps a list of 30 bugs that could cause the next global pandemic, and this is now at the top of that list. So the broader point, I think, is to see the future more clearly. It can sometimes help to anticipate what seems to be extremely unlikely, because sometimes the unlikely things actually do happen. You can read more about all of these trends at economist.com/worldahead2025. You can read the World Ahead if you're a subscriber on our website, in the app. You can buy it on newsstands. But I wish you the best of luck in navigating the coming year, whatever surprises it may spring. Thank you for listening. And now let's go to Q&A.
As always, Tom, marvelous presentation. And let me just encourage people to go ahead and send in their questions and comments. One thing that you did not mention that I heard or read in the World Ahead was about the potential of a vaccine, a targeted vaccine on cancer.
Yeah,
which is
no,
remarkable. Talk
that's
about
true.
that.
You're absolutely right. And I quite often, when I've given this sort of, it's not exactly Santa Claus ho ho ho, is it? It's quite depressing, some of this stuff. I'm very often asked, oh, go on, end on an optimistic note. What is there? And in fact, that is my go-to example. The cancer vaccine stuff really is amazing. People have been trying to make vaccines that are key to individual cancers for several decades, and it looks like they're finally about to make it work. And the interesting thing is why they're about to make it work. And it's because of two things that we didn't have even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And one of them is the mRNA technology that was used to make the COVID vaccines. And when you sequence when you make one of these vaccines, you take a sample from a tumor, you sequence it, and then you make a vaccine that is key to that tumor. And you have to be able to do that sequencing really quickly, and then you have to basically print out this sort of personalized vaccine. We now have the technology to do all of that because you can make it as an mRNA vaccine, and the proof of concept that COVID gave us means that we can now do that in a way we could not before. So it's weirdly a side effect, a benefit of COVID. The second thing is that you have to choose which mutations in the cancer you're actually going to target with the vaccine. And that's quite a difficult challenge. It's a data analysis challenge. And it turns out you can use AI to do that. So AI and COVID vaccines are giving us, put together, cancer vaccines next year potentially. So look out for that. And I think it's a really good example of how science progresses and how you can always build on the previous success. And it's also, I think, an example of how AI can be an accelerator for progress in other areas, like the fight against climate change, like medicine, and so forth.
Who are the super forecasters? We haven't talked about that yet.
Oh,
And
yes.
now we can participate. I didn't know that I could enter the contest.
Oh yeah, no, you always have been. We've done a contest for many years. So the super forecasters are a team of geopolitical forecasters using a method that was, well, it actually goes back to the Rand Corporation in the 50s. But Philip Tetlock at UPenn came up with a sort of super version of this called super forecasting, and it's the idea that some people are very, very good at putting aside their cognitive biases and making very accurate predictions. And the US intelligence community held a competition for geopolitical forecasting, and the super forecasting team won by a very large margin. And then the next year they had the competition again, and again the super forecasters won again. So they basically stopped having the competition because it was very, very clear that the super forecasters were the best team and they had the best method. And so we're very lucky that the super forecasting folks give us a page full of their predictions each year. And then we also have a competition where you can go and pit your wits against them. And they have an open platform called GJ Open where they do this. And interestingly, the winners of those annual competitions very often end up getting added to the super forecasting team. So it's been a kind of career changing moment for some readers of the world ahead that they've ended up becoming super forecasters. So yes,
Great
we have
fun.
a bunch from them as well.
And I won't read all of them, but one of them was likelihood of a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine before October 25, 25 next year. 34% think that
Yeah.
will happen. Let me bring in a question from Ray Termini. Oh, I hope he's right. Could we see an end to passwords and instead rely on face recognition and voice authentication?
It's not quite so much that, it's face recognition. And in fact, we had this as a forecast for 2024, I think it was. Basically, there's a new technology called pass keys, and it's where the fact that you have much better biometric authentication on your phone because you generally have face recognition, fingerprints, that kind of stuff. It's a system where you essentially use a token from your phone to log into stuff on your phone, but also stuff on your computer. And it's now quite widely supported. It's in the latest version of iOS and Android, and a lot of websites let you do this now. And if you go and check, and sometimes you'll log into something and it'll say, I think PayPal does this, eBay does this. It'll say, do you want to switch to using pass keys? And the answer should always be yes. Just say yes, because the thing about a pass key is you can't forget it, you can't lose it, and it can't be stolen. And you're just literally using your phone as you're using the biometric sign-in on your phone. But it's real Dick Tracy stuff. Like you go to eBay and it says, is that really you? And I just have to double click on my watch and it knows that it's me because I previously signed into my phone using my face, and my phone is talking to my watch, which is talking to my computer. And honestly, it's brilliant. So I think that's where this is going. And as I say, it's great because you can't forget them or lose them or have them stolen.
Excellent. The next thing, of course, is I have to figure out how to turn off the beeps and the messages on all the devices. So Greg Gosick says, with the recent assassination of the United Health CEO and social media reactions, are there any signs that waxing populism may be reacting more violently toward established elites? Thank you, Greg.
I'm not sure. Yes, I don't know whether it's fair to read that one as a sort of populist backlash, or I think this has a lot more to do with the structure of the US healthcare system, and it's actually quite unfair because people blame the insurers for this. It's essentially because the insurers are the ones who have to do the rationing in American healthcare. The doctors can just sign you up for as much as you like, and then it's kind of not their problem. The doctors are never the ones who say no to you. It's the insurers, and so as a result, the insurers are hated by many Americans. In Britain, we have a national health system, and we have a formal system. I mean, it was famously called death panels once, which is not what it is, but essentially we have an institute called NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, and it decides which treatments are and are not available on the NHS. And so that's how we do it, and that's how health is rationed. And if it's on the list, you can get it, and if it's not, you can't. And so getting on the list means that we are able to get good prices from drug companies. We can say, actually, we won't put this on the list at that price, but and there's been some quite interesting, innovative pricing models like pay for outcome. So there are some drugs that only work in some fraction of the population, and so you basically only get paid if it works, and that's, I think, quite interesting. We've seen efforts by, I think, one of the unsung things that Joe Biden has done very well is negotiating with drug companies to get drug prices down. Donald Trump says he's going to continue that. So I think this is really more a reflection of the weird nature of the American healthcare system than it is anything to do with populism.
No surprise here. We have two or three questions about Iran from Beckett Potter in Dallas and then an anonymous attendee. Where does Iran stand with regard to its proxies? And what about, Beckett asks, possibility of Iran developing weapons of mass destruction?
Right. So Iran clearly is, to say it's on the back foot would be understating it. I mean, Israel has taken out its missile defense system. It's a sitting duck, and it's also had its proxies decapitated in Gaza and in Lebanon. And it was unable to support Assad. The collapse in Syria is a reflection of the weakness of Iran and also of Russia, and the fact that Russia is distracted by its disastrous invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, Iran. We actually have a piece on Iran about whether there's a chance of some kind of rapprochement with America, and Donald Trump has talked about how he really does, he wants to do a deal with Iran. So, that is a possibility. So that's one way it could go. The thing is, he would insist on a handshake, and I just don't know whether Khomeini would, be prepared to do that.
And the
That would be
emphasis on transactions, which you write about quite a bit.
exactly. But I mean, Iran is it's in a position of weakness. Now, the nightmare scenario for both Iran and Russia is that a weaker country, and to some extent with China as well, particularly its economic weakness, the nightmare scenario is that weaker countries are more unpredictable and more unstable. One of the things that I worry about is that if there is a nasty trade war, and that weakens the Chinese economy, because there are some really quite apocalyptic forecasts of how much a big trade war could affect Chinese GDP growth. It could knock it down by 2 points. And there's already quite a big problem with youth unemployment in China. What's the classic thing that an autocratic leader does when they start to become unpopular and there's unrest? They start a war, and that's what worries me, both with Iran and with China. And Russia, of course, already has one, but it could escalate it. It could attack another country. So I think the optimistic view is that this is a great opportunity to do a deal with Iran, and take the nuclear threat off the table, get rid of the sanctions, and then it can sort of go back to being a normal country. But it's very hard to know, and that would involve a lot of face for its loss of face for its leadership, and so I think that would be very tricky. But Donald Trump seems to be indicating that he is up for doing a deal, and he is nothing if not a deal maker. So fingers crossed.
So Richard has a very interesting question, I think. What are the likely impacts of right-wing attacks on expertise, education, and research in the United States on economic growth and national security?
Yeah, well, we're about to find out because Trump is choosing people because they look good on TV and not because they necessarily know what they're doing. And for a certain amount of time, and we've had this in Britain as well, where we've sort of introduced, frankly, quite stupid economic policies like Brexit, because people like the sound of them, but they didn't add up, and they didn't make sense. And it was during the Brexit campaign that a cabinet minister here said people are tired of experts. But it turned out all the things the experts said about Brexit were right. It did, it did reduce trade, and it did reduce economic growth in Britain. And now a majority of people in Britain would like to undo it. And in fact, there was just a survey today showing that people would like to rejoin the single market, and they would accept the free movement of people to and from Europe, which is the main thing that they got rid of with voting for Brexit. They would be okay for that to come back if we could rejoin the single market and reignite trade. So I think essentially, eventually, reality reasserts itself. So I'm sure we'll have lots of fun and games with Donald Trump trying outlandish economic policies, and we'll see whether they actually deliver the sorts of things that he says they will. And in particular on the tariffs, I mean, he thinks this is a magic money tree and that this is a way of taking money away from China. It's not. It's a sales tax on US consumers. Kamala Harris called it that in the debate. She said, "You are proposing a sales tax on US consumers," and Trump was visibly perplexed by this. He said, "What are you talking about? I'm not talking about having a sales tax." He's also talked about getting rid of income tax in favor of tariffs. But in effect, what you would be doing there is replacing income taxes with very large sales taxes. So again, this doesn't make sense. And I hope that there are enough people around Trump who will say, actually, this is not a great idea.
We will see.
We'll see. I mean, people have been talking about the tariffs on Mexico as a guacamole tax, which I think is a very, very smart way of explaining this to Donald Trump, because a 25% guacamole tax, so the US gets about half its fresh fruit and vegetables from Mexico. Imagine putting up the price of guacamole by 25% right before the Super Bowl. That would be, political.
As someone who has an avocado from Trader Joe's almost every morning, that would be a problem.
There you go.
Believe suddenly we're getting just a plethora of questions. So we'll try to knock out.
I must be being too mean about Donald Trump, so everyone wants to know.
I guess. So let's see if we can hit a few of them very quickly in the remaining 3 or 4 minutes. This is a quick one. Stephen Shore asks, how likely is the UK to rejoin the EU?
I think we'll have closer ties. I think we might go back into the single market or the customs union, but full rejoining of the EU, it's very hard to imagine that. I think where we're going generally is towards a more multi-speed Europe. I think we're going to build ties with our European partners, closer ties on defence. Obviously, we're in NATO. We've got this thing called the Joint Expeditionary Force. So I think the direction of travel is closer, more closeness with Europe. But I think full EU membership is at least 10 years away and may actually never happen. We may just be in a kind of outer tier of Europe because we're not even in, we weren't in the Euro before. So yeah, I certainly not next year and certainly not for a decade, I wouldn't have thought.
An important comment from Donna Wilhelm. In addition to world conflicts affecting tourism, isn't climate change unpredictability a huge challenge to travel services?
It is, and we are seeing some countries suffering from that. So Spain is becoming, and southern Italy is becoming very, very hot, and we're also seeing some countries trying to prosper from that. So you can now go to Greenland; they've just opened their first airport for tourists, and Northern Europe. So the Scandinavian countries are saying, "Come and have a coolcation here." And actually, I have been to Scandinavia a couple of times this year, and it is a very nice place to go. And it's not the kind of freezing northern wasteland that some people seem to think it is.
And I'll have 1 or 2 more questions, but let me remind everybody that I'll be back on Monday with a real-time report sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, real-time report on Syria with Ambassador David Satterfield, and that'll be at 1 p.m. Central Time. Hope you can join us. Just go to the dfwworld.org to sign up for that free program. So Adam Wasserman says, how long can Russia sustain the war in Ukraine, giving them out of the rising inflation? Are we too pessimistic about Ukraine's chances? I'll give you 30 seconds on that.
Okay. I think basically both sides would like to do a deal next year. Ukraine is exhausted, and polls show that most people think that they should just, that they should do a deal, that they should go into talks. The risk is, of course, that nothing that Vladimir Putin signs is worth the paper it's written on. But yes, this is also Russia would also like to call an end into the fighting because, yeah, inflation at its levels, interest rates at 21%. This is really painful for Russian business, but also if the Saudis turn on the taps next year to steal market share in oil, then that's going to make the oil price go down, and that's the only way that that Putin can pay for his war right now is by selling oil, and so it will get even harder if the oil price goes down. So yes, I think it all points to some kind of negotiated settlement next year, but let's see what happens.
And there's a calendar of 2025 in April. Plan to go to Osaka, Japan for Expo 2025. And you don't want to miss the Women's Rugby World Cup in Finland, or in October, no more advertising of junk food online.
Oh, that's only in Britain. That's only in Britain.
Only in Britain.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, we have a calendar of weird and wonderful things that are
It
happening
is
next
wonderful.
year.
Tom, as always, congratulations. It's great fun reading it. Just another one of the reasons to subscribe to The Economist. Want to wish everybody on behalf of all of our sponsors, especially the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, happy holidays, Merry Christmas.